Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking all about straw bale gardening. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. So you want to know about growing a straw bale garden? Well, I'm going to be honest. I've grown in straw bales a couple of times, and they've been really hit and miss for me. And I've seen lots of people growing them. In fact, some people that I follow on YouTube grow only in straw bale gardens, and they have huge successes with it, and they look like they do really, really well. And I've had success in my straw bale gardens as well. And that was probably about 4 years ago. I lived in a different property. I had a different soil type. I had a heavy clay soil. And so I put a couple of straw bales kind of out in the middle of, the garden area. So there were areas that would get, wet from the sprinklers. They had like the various soil microbes and, bugs and stuff kind of moving in and out of them. And, the stuff that I grew in there grew pretty well. I actually grew predominantly corn in those ones in the middle of the garden. And it did pretty well. The beans that I had growing around the edges and stuff, they were a little hit and miss. And I think some of that was because on one side it was, in total shade. So it didn't get as much sunlight. But the other side was, it was okay, right? The nice thing about growing in straw bales is you've got a lot more kind of surface area to be able to grow in for the footprint. So, you've got 6 sides that you can plant on, including the top, not including the bottom, right? So you've got a lot more that you can grow in that small space. So I can see the appeal of them from, having a small space and wanting to really maximize the amount that you're growing in that space because, there's a lot more area that you can actually utilize by using a straw bale. However, I've also had some that just didn't work. So I had some bales that were taking forever to come to a state where I could actually grow in them. I found that some of them dried out really quickly. I've had mice set up shop in my straw bales, and because I had, I have a couple of dogs, inevitably there's a corner that they would pee on too. So, I obviously didn't want to plant my veggies anywhere near that. So, depending on the space that you have available and the amount of time, ahead of the growing season that you've got, I think straw bale gardening could definitely be something, that should get a bit more popularity. And the nice thing about straw bales is when you're done with them, you can just break them up, put them in the compost bin. You could spread them, around flower beds or on your vegetable garden as being a mulch. So, they'll decompose and add organic matter to the soil after that you're done with them. So it's kind of nice. And straw bales are pretty easy to pick up, right? You can pick them up at the feed store, or you can probably find a local supplier. That's how I got my first set of bales, was through a local supplier, and the ones that I bought had basically gotten wet over winter, so they weren't any good as being sold as animal feed. But they were decomposing nicely and they were perfect for gardening in. So that's what I used. But this year, I've got a bunch of straw bales that I've had sat in the garden for well over a season now. These ones didn't do so great because they weren't getting watered on a regular basis. I had to go out and actually water them because of how our sprinklers were set up. It wasn't getting the actual straw bales. And I was spreading them with compost and things, and towards the very end of last year, I had some herb plants. I had a couple of tansy plants that I didn't know where to put, so I just kind of shoved them in the straw bale and thought, if it makes it through the winter, I'll figure out where to put it next. But this last weekend, when I just went outside, they're growing, and they're growing really happily. So I'm encouraged that this year will be the year where I can actually grow a decent harvest out of my straw bales. And this year I'm going to be doing tomatoes in it, because the straw bale fits perfectly in the tomato cages that we have, and my husband really wants to give it a go. So that's his pet project. He wants a wall of tomatoes. So that's what we're going to do. And the cool thing is, now that everything's kind of broken down a bit, I mean, granted, I've had a bit of trouble with one of the dogs kind of digging like one of the bales apart, so it's kind of really busted down, and isn't going to be able to kind of support growing anything industrious. So we're probably not going to be putting tomatoes in that one, which of course is right in the middle of everything, so it kind of spoils the look of the wall of tomatoes. But I think we might try something trailing, like a cucumber or something instead in there. So the space isn't going to go to waste, basically. But what we did, and we've got a couple more hay bales that have been sat outside all winter, so they've had a lot of sun on them, a lot of snow, a lot of rain, so they're starting to kind of break down now, and I can tell because they're starting to sprout a little bit, but because it's still early spring, it's like end of March here, at the time that I'm recording this, so I've still got an opportunity to start getting those straw bits breaking down, basically. And you do that, you need to do what's known as conditioning the bales. So it starts with getting it wet, and you gotta keep wetting it on a consistent basis, and conditioning can be like 3 months worth of time before your bale is going to be ready. And I know in a lot of areas, you can't do that at the beginning of the year because it's so, cold. There's a lot of snow on the ground. The temperatures are just not conducive to that. So what you can do is you can expedite the conditioning, which, obviously you can leave them outside during winter if you're picking them up in fall. But in the spring, if you pick them up, you want to get them super wet, and you want to hose them down for 4 days. And you want to go out every day and make sure that those things are sodden. You want it soaked through. And then on the 5th day, you would start to add some amendments to help speed up that composting process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the traditional or the chemical version that you can do, and then I'm going to talk about the organic version. So I want to give you guys the option of which you want to do, because sometimes it's driven completely by time and the time that you have available. So this process, like I said, it takes time if you're doing it from an organic perspective, but from a chemical conditioning process, what you would want to do is soak your bales just as you would before for 4 days, and then on the 5th day you would put half a cup of ammonium sulfate and 2 cups of dolomite lime onto the surface of each bale, and then you'd kind of slowly water it, usually with a watering can or something, so you're not splashing it all over the place. And as those chemical materials are going to work through that bale, they're basically providing a massive nitrogen kick, and what that's going to do is it's going to kickstart that composting process within that bale and get everything moving. So what you're going to notice is the bale itself is going to start to feel warm as decomposition happens. So that's day 5. So day 5, half a cup of ammonium sulfate, 2 cups of dolomite lime. Okay. And then over the next 5 days, you are going to put on half a cup of ammonium sulfate every day to each bale, and you're going to gently water it in. And you're definitely going to be feeling it warming up. And that should happen round about day 8, 9, somewhere around there. And then on the 11th day, you can layer on a cup of all-purpose all-round fertilizer on top of the bale and then water that in. And then water it again on the 12th day and feel around the outside of the bale. So you want to feel all the sides and see how warm they are. And if it's still feeling warm, you don't want to be planting your plants into it, because it's just going to be too high of nitrogen, and you're going to have your plants are going to burn basically, because it's too hot and there's too much nitrogen in there, and the plants can't handle it. Okay, it's too saturated. So you're going to water it again and just keep checking to see how cool the outside of the bale is. And you can even check inside too and just see how warm it is. If you've got a long thermometer, like a composting thermometer, even better. You can use that to check how hot or cool it is. And then usually, like when the bale is cooled, you can start planting then. So that's the chemical way. So about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on how hot the bale gets. It could even be 6 weeks before you're able to plant. On a organic perspective, there's things that we can add to it that's going to help speed up that decomposition, but it's going to be much slower, because we're really relying on those microbes to settle in and find their groove and actually start that process. So what do we do for organic? Well, I like to use a fish emulsion fertilizer. So I've got an organic unrelisted one, and I will make that up, and I will use that to water the bales with on the 5th day. So I still do the same thing that you would if you were doing a kind of chemically treated one. You would water it for 4 days, and then on the 5th day you start adding the amendments. So I use fish emulsion, but then I also do comfrey tea, and I make it quite strong. So I would use the normal strained comfrey stuff that you kind of make using a liquid fertilizer. You normally dilute that down if you're watering your plants with it. I use it neat on the bales, and I've also added in some compost from like the chicken house, so chicken manure, and those things are all quite high in nitrogen and also in microbes, and will help kind of start that rotting process. You can also use a soil inoculant that's got microbes in it to help kind of break those things down. So that's what I do. And I'll keep watering with these organic fertilizers for a couple of days. So days 5, day 6, day 7, and day 8 have all got some sort of additional organic fertilizer that's been added to the water. And then I'll do the same thing. I'm going to check to see if it's heating up inside the bale. If it isn't, then I'm going to hit it again with some more of the organic fertilizer, and then I'm going to start spreading compost and manure on top of those bales. And for the last year, I just kind of left them and just wanted them to kind of break down on their own. And now that I'm in the next season, they're beautiful compost inside. They're most definitely ready for me to start getting my plants in there. I'm just waiting for the weather to get a little bit better. So you don't have to use chemicals to start your hay bales off. Just be warned that if you're using an organic method for it, it is going to take longer, and it can take up to 3 months, if not longer. So that's just something to bear in mind. The other thing to have a think about is what it is that you're going to want to grow in there. And, a lot of things that are out there say that tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, melons, beans, those kind of things all do quite well in a straw bale, but things that need space for the roots to grow, like potatoes and stuff, and sweet potatoes, don't really grow well in a straw or hay bale type of environment. So that's just something to think about. Now, of course, it wouldn't be a conversation about straw bale gardening if we didn't touch on the use of herbicides and their impact on them. So if you guys weren't aware, a lot of commercial growers have to use broadleaf herbicides to control the weeds that are growing in their fields. And there's a number of reasons why they do this, but predominantly it will be to ensure that the field is going to be growing the hay or the straw crops that they are needing, because farmers obviously are dependent on, having large yields, to form their livelihood, basically. So I understand the use of it. I also understand that it is very difficult for people to go ahead and try and trace back where that hay or straw has come from, and especially if you're getting it from like a big box store or something, and actually have some assurance whether or not your bale has been treated with some of these herbicides and compounds. And the problem with them is that they stay around for quite some time. So just the nature of the structure of the chemicals that are in there, they hang around for a long time, and they can work their way up in the food chain. And that's why sometimes you can have problems with your garden if you end up with manure from animals that have been fed these, hay and feedstock things that have been treated with this broadleaf pesticide, because it stays around and then it ends up killing your plants later. The same thing can happen with your hay bale. If your hay bale has been treated, or your straw bale has been treated, your plants are not going to grow as well. They might still grow, but they are most definitely going to be weaker, and they're going to struggle. So if you can, try and find a local grower of hay or straw and see if you can, get something from there. If you haven't been able to source something locally and have some assurance that it's organically grown and it hasn't been treated with pesticides, there is a way that you can test it to see if it has been treated. And there's a couple of things that you're going to need for that. Number one, you're going to need your hay bale. Number two, you're going to need some quick growing peas or beans, some sort of legumes. And you are going to need a 5-gallon bucket and some water. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to grow your peas or beans, and you're going to wait till they get a couple of inches tall. And then you're going to mix some of the straw or hay with water in your 5-gallon bucket. And it's probably best if you use like water that's kind of sat overnight, so it's not chlorinated anymore. But basically put some straw and hay, like a few handfuls, into the water and stir it for a day or two. Okay. And then just leave it, but you're going to use that water on your legumes. And if you use beans, it's going to be really easy to see, and you can use peas too, but I think because beans have got the bigger leaves, it's much easier to see if there's problems. And what you do is, as you're watering your beans or peas with this water from the straw water, you're going to take a look and see how the plants are responding to this water. And basically, if the second and third set of leaves, are looking normal, then your straw or hay is probably safe to use. If you start seeing weird stuff happening, like they start to shrivel up and die, or they start to look wilting, or they start to look a little weaker, that they just don't look right, it's possible that the original farmer sprayed something on, the plants in your straw or hay. And, you can choose to use it, or you can choose not to use it. And if you choose not to use it, then you're probably not going to want to spread the straw and stuff around your yard anyway, and certainly not in places that you're going to eat. I mean, for me, if I had it, and some of the straw bales that I had showed positive, I would probably still use the straw, because I don't like things being wasted, but I would probably use it in areas of the garden where I don't have edible foods. I would probably put them out in like our front yard where I'm growing, flowers and bushes, those kind of things. Now, that tip for seeing whether your straw bales or hay bales have been treated, I spotted a while ago, and I want to say it was on a video by the Grow Network. They recently did a online homegrown food summit, which was really useful. Lots of great content there that was free, and I want to say it might have been on one of those. I've been watching a lot of stuff recently, so it might have been on there, but it's also a good way to test to see if manure's got some problems on it too before you go ahead and spread it all out over your yard, and end up contaminating everything that's there. So there's a good side and a bad side to straw bale gardening, and the more information that you have about the origin of your straw bales or your hay bales, the better you will be. If you can, try and get organic wherever possible, and if you can't, just test it before you go ahead and spend all that energy into conditioning a bale and then trying to grow stuff in it and then it doesn't work. So some of the tips for growing in your hay bale, if you've got a problem with mice or other rodents, a good way to help deter them is to keep watering the bales on a daily basis with the water fully saturating the bale, because rodents want somewhere that's dry and undercover, so keeping it wet will help deter them. Another thing to note is you will get seeds germinating in it. It's just a fact that if you're using hay, that is basically grasses. If it is straw, you're going to get like the odd kind of grass seed coming up in there. They're easy to pull out, and that's all that you do is just pull those out, but just know that you are going to get them popping up. Keep an eye on your bales as well and the plants that are growing in them. Check them regularly to make sure that they're moist enough, that they're getting enough water, and also check them to see their overall growth and vitality, and just see if they need some extra feed. I know some people have started conditioning their bales using things like bloodfish and bone fertilizer or feather meal. Those kind of things are high in nitrogen to help kickstart the process, and you can get organic variants of those as well. But because of the amount of sort of high nitrogen fertilizer that you're using, you can run into some trouble with things like tomatoes and peppers and squashes with blossom end rot. So just keep an eye on it, and adjust with some calcium and magnesium as needed. Some people like to use things like crushed eggshells or an actual organic calcium spray. Other people for magnesium like to use a bit of Epsom salts when they're planting, and just kind of monitoring throughout its growing. I also like to add a bit of kelp meal. That seems to help provide some extra minerals which, aren't present in the straw bale. And I also like to give a little bit of a dusting with rock dust as well. And I use, various organic liquid fertilizers to feed my garden normally. But this year I'm going to try something a little bit different, which I've been doing with my seedlings that I've been transplanting and potting on into bigger containers, and that is some worm castings. So I'm going to see if using some worm castings as a side dressing throughout the growing season, whether that's going to help with some of the issues of kind of running out of nutrients as the bales get a little bit older. And of course, the addition of some good, well rotted compost is always going to benefit your garden. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, I hope that you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And I hope that your garden grows beautifully. Have a good one. This podcast uses the song Exhilarate by Kevin MacLeod from incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. The song is used for both the beginning and ending credits.